All right, so tonight we are talking about ferns. We will talk a little bit about their life history, their natural history, and then go into how to identify them in general. We'll cover a few of the species tonight. So the actual program outline, we will go over what are ferns, where they lie in the plant kingdom, and then their life cycle, which is also fairly interesting. The overall benefits of ferns, like why you might want to have them in your own native plant garden, and then some tips and tricks to identify ferns, or just things to keep in your mind when you go about identifying these types of plants. And then some of the common species in Pennsylvania. As always, I'll close with some resources that you can use to learn more about ferns, or some field guides that I find to be very, very helpful on this topic. And at the very end, we'll have plenty of time for questions. If you have a question, if you want to throw it in the chat during the program, I'll try to answer them as we go. And then at the very end, if you have anything, we'll go through them all as well. So in the overall kingdom of life, we have this nice little simplified tree here. Each of the nodes kind of represents a breaking point. So we have our bacteria and our archaea, these single cell organisms over here. You've got this like trash can group called the protists, where it's more or less organisms that we aren't really sure where they lie. But after that, we have some plants. And that is where we are going to focus, is on the kingdom of plants. So with plants, we can start with three categories. Here at the top, I have a dotted line because algae, it's a little different. Algae is mostly protists. There are some that could be considered plants. It's all kind of there's multiple things that could be considered algae, but the other break were our bryophytes. So our bryophytes, they are multicellular, they're land plants, but they're not vascular. So it's more or less kind of just a tiny, thin, single cell thick leaf. And these are the things like our mosses. But then we had another group over here, our vascular plants. So our vascular plants have tissue that allows them to put or to bring water and sap throughout the plant. So we'll follow our vascular plants to another split, and this one's very complicated. We have either club mosses or not club mosses. So our club mosses are vascular plants. They're mostly evergreen and they have some sort of underground gametophyte stage. And we'll talk about gametophyte and sporophyte when we get to the life cycle of ferns. But this gametophyte stage, it occurs underground. They're overall kind of primitive because they have microphyllous leaves. So these are just tiny unbranched veined leaves, and they're just single. They look like scales. So if you've ever seen a club moss, look real close, and it's mostly like a scale leaf. And if you got a hand lens on it, you'd see that there's just this one unbranched leaf vein versus all these other plants that are not club mosses. They have megaphyllous leaves. So these leaves are much larger and they will have like veins that branch and are reticulate, and they'll have multiple veins per leaf. And if we continue with our not club mosses, we can just kind of break this into seed plants. So the plants that produce seeds, or our ferns. So this is where we have our ferns. And the plants that we consider ferns aren't just the normal lacy things, but also things like horsetails, whisk ferns, which look much different than our normal ferns, and a very awesome group of ferns called adder's tongues. If you see these, you're very lucky. These can be quite rare, but they are ferns. And then we have what we'll call our true ferns. So we'll really focus on the true ferns tonight, but I do want to kind of hammer down that what's not included are our club mosses and our true mosses. So these are not ferns. And of course, whenever you get into any sort of new natural history topic, it always comes with a whole bunch of new terminology. And it's very important to spend some time on the terminology so that you can understand your field guides. And with ferns, it's no different. We will have some specific anatomy terms when it comes to ferns. And up first, The leafy part above here, so not this little stalk on this side, but the actual leafy part we will call a blade. So this entire leafy-like thing here, we're going to call a blade. The mushroom-loving friends over in the audience might recognize this term. So the stem we are going to call a stipe. So the part of the stem below the blade is our stipe. And then once the little leafy-like things, which we'll have a term for in a second, start to occur, that's our blade. So the stipe and the blade total the frond. So the above ground growth that we see on an individual fern, we would call the frond. And you can think of it more or less as the leaf. So the entire leaf of this fern is this structure. This space in between, we'll say right now these are pinna. So the space in between, the stipe portion right here, is called the rachis. And it's important to look at that because certain features on the rachis will help you in identifying individual species. So sometimes the stipe will have brown scales and no hair, and the rachis will have fine little hairs or just hairs on the underside in one portion near the pinna. So that term right here is also very important. So the space in between right here. And then we also have the rhizome. Now, the rhizome is essentially the stem of the fern. It grows horizontally just below the surface of whatever substrate it's growing on. So just below the soil, it kind of grows horizontal right there, and that's the stem. So if you think of kind of putting a plant on its side, slightly burying it, and the leaf would poke out, that's how you should envision a fern. On the rhizome, deeper into the substrate, are the actual roots. They're very similar to plants that produce seeds. So they're fibrous, they're absorbing water, they're absorbing nutrients. So it's all right here. Now, I mentioned the term pinna, so we're going to take a little bit of a closer look here. This portion, the entire little thing, is a pinna. Pinna just means ear. So it's a little ear on the fern. And the tiny little ear within the ear is the pinnule. It is important to know the pinna and how it divides, which we'll talk about in a second, but the tinier portion right there is the pinnule. In any good field guide, they will have something similar to this, where it will show you all the different terminology, and it's important to kind of start to at least learn things like rachis and stipe and blade and pinna, because as you go about identifying these, certain traits are going to be on here, and once you know what to look for, the presence or absence of certain features, you're going to start to realize that ferns aren't as hard to ID as they appear to be. In fact, this can be a topic that if you spend some time on, you could really start to master it. There aren't too many ferns. There are around 60 or so in Pennsylvania, which compared to things like birds or mushrooms or just other plants and flowers, it's a lot more approachable. So once you really start to look for certain things, you're gonna find that you can identify a lot of the ferns on your walks. As a fern starts to form, I wanted to show off the fiddleheads. So this is the frond that's all furled up on a young fern. So as it comes up, it'll look like this. You got that nice little spiral, fiddlehead, little violin head. It comes up and it starts to unfurl, and here we can start to see the pinna on this fern. Fiddleheads are harvestable for some species. They're pretty delicious. They're a very tasty green. However, you have to make sure to identify the species that you're harvesting these from. And the reason why is some of the ferns are toxic. Some ferns, the fiddleheads in the entire plant, actually can be carcinogenic. So you want to make sure you're harvesting from species that are edible. You can't just eat any fiddlehead. So if you're interested in that, I definitely recommend looking with some foragers and getting a nice forager guide or a field guide on ferns that talks about the edibility of these fiddleheads. They are pretty tasty, but do know that this is the frond for that fern. So by harvesting this, we will not have this individual frond on the landscape. So that's kind of a little brief overview on ferns in general, and we're going to go into their life cycle, which is pretty interesting. This graphic here is kind of the whole process, and we have it divided into two things, the sporophyte and the gametophyte. The sporophyte is the dominant life cycle for ferns. It's the phase that we see the most of. And what sporophyte means is it's the plant that produces the spores. So the sporophyte stage produces spores. The gametophyte stage, which is nearly microscopic, it's just tiny, it's not quite microscopic in most species, but the gametophyte stage will produce the gametes, the egg and the sperm. So the fern's life cycle is split between these two things. And the sporophyte stage can have some vegetative growth. So as the stem continues to grow, it's going to send up another frond. So it can spread, but the gametophyte stage is what allows for genetic diversity and for much potentially longer dispersal, much further dispersal. Now, the sporophyte stage, this is what we see. It's the most conspicuous stage of ferns. It's the one that produces the spores. Now, on the underside of ferns that produce these, you have something called a sori. Now, the sori is a cluster of sporangia, the spore-bearing structure. But what's important about the sori is they come in a lot of different shapes. So again, this is on the underside of the frond. I encourage you, if you have never seen this before, the next time you see a fern, kind of lift it up gently and look on the underside. You're going to see structures that look like the little airplane pillows that they're not as comfortable. I mean, no one sleeps on an airplane comfortably, but they look like little airplane pillows, or they look like little hot dogs. Or sometimes the sori is covered with an indusia or indusium. And this is a scale that overlaps those little sporangium structures, kind of protecting them from some of the elements. And so they can develop before the spores produce. And again, these sori will come in all sorts of different shapes. And this is such a critical component when you're identifying ferns. Some ferns, if these aren't currently present, it's almost impossible to identify the fern. So these structures will vary from species to species. And this one has a little false indusium, so we'll talk about that. It's actually just a rolled over portion of the pinna with the sporangia on the inside. And the sporangia, you won't really see these. They're much, much tinier than the naked eye can see. And it's this little structure like this, but the drawing does a better job. So it's this casing, which we see here, has the spores developing on the inside. And when conditions are just right, this little backbone comes under pressure. And as it pressurizes, it snaps and it rips open, releasing the spores and ejects them. And the spores are so lightweight that wind will easily carry these off. So the spores then become airborne and they can carry off and will germinate into hopefully the gametophyte stage. So when a spore lands on an appropriate substrate, usually some rich soil with a lot of water, that could produce the prothallus. So this is the gametophyte stage. We are now onto the inconspicuous stage. You can see that this is the fingertip of someone. This photo was taken in the native plant nursery. We do propagate our ferns on site, and so we will see these little prothalli. And the prothallus is just this little weird scale that will form over here, and then you got two different structures. You have the antheridium, and the antheridium produces the sperm. So if you're familiar with floral anatomy, the anther is the part that produces the pollen. So it's the kind of considered the male part of the flower. The same thing with ferns. So the antheridium is producing the sperm, and sperm in Ferns, they're flagellated, but they have way more than just one flagella sometimes. They are pretty crazy. You can find on YouTube some 3D recreations of fern reproduction, and these things look like little alien battleships. And so they do require water for the sexual reproduction to occur, but the antheridium will produce the sperm, and then the archegonium produces the egg. And what's interesting is on the prothallus, so one individual prothallus is going to form both of these structures, but they usually are timed differently. So the antheridium might be first, and then you have all these little sperm that are hopefully in like a flood, like a really good rain event like we're having today. So these antheridium will release the sperm, and hopefully they'll be motile, moving around long enough to survive until the prothallus then switches to the archegonium. And what that allows is hopefully it's not just self-fertilizing itself. We want to see genetic diversity, or the fern wants to see genetic diversity. So by having these staged at different times, you're going to see a better chance of it hitting a different individual than itself. And once the sperm hits the archegonium and fertilizes the egg, it begins to develop the first little bit of a fern. So that's what this little leaf is. So the prothallus is going to kind of just dry up, die off, and then this structure right here is going to be the new fern growth, and it will also send down the rhizome and the root hairs right here. So this is all happening. If you ever see one of these, again, just like the adder's tongue, consider yourself lucky because these are tiny little things. But if you kind of know where to look and go out on a rainy day to maybe a rocky waterfall-like area that you know have a lot of ferns, really just focus and you might see this heart-shaped structure. You can also propagate ferns at home. Occasionally, we do workshops on this with Roxanne leading those, and you can learn how to make sure you have a sterile environment, release the spores into soil, and you'll actually end up with prothalli. But the question might be, why would you even want to propagate ferns? What are the benefits of having ferns in your garden? They aren't giving you any flowers. They're not really good for pollinators. They're not making seeds for birds. Some of them are not evergreen, so you don't even get winter interest for them. So why even bother having these? One of the main things is they create these very unique microhabitats that are critical for a number of different beneficial insects and other organisms like small mammals will readily seek shade and shelter within these. So we have even bigger mammals use these with deer oftentimes finding a fern glade to tuck their very young fawn into because they hide the animal so well. So they are very important microhabitats for smaller organisms, and some of our larger organisms will also use them. And as they're creating this shade and shelter, they tend to trap a little bit more moisture, so it alters the habitat around that area for things like firefly larvae. They will seek slugs and snails in that wet environment. So by having some ferns in the area, you might increase your chance of seeing more fireflies. Ferns are also uniquely adapted for growing on slopes and they rock faces, cliffs, or just boulders. So they can be very good at erosion control because sometimes they're the only thing that will grow on a shady slope. And that is one of the best things that you can have in those situations where you have a bank that just doesn't quite grow much of anything. Maybe there's a moss patch, maybe a white wood aster occasionally shows up. Try some ferns. As long as the soil isn't incredibly dry, you can try to get some ferns in there. They will need shade, they will need somewhat moist soil, but if you have that situation where you have this shady slope that nothing really grows on, give ferns a chance because they can also help hold that area in place. And with that, they're going to help promote soil health. A lot of these fronds are annual. So what they will do is the frond dies back in the wintertime, and that's just adding some more carbon to the soil. But one study, this one was in China, so the subtropics of China found that there were a lot of pine plantations. And as they harvested the pines, they would find that ferns would be one of the first understory plants to come back into that understory area of the harvested site. And the soil carbon that was utilized by all the plants, most of it was coming from those ferns. So they were able to come in, colonize the area, kind of die back, and alter the soil chemistry. Because I'm sure some of you are aware that growing stuff under pine trees can be very hard. It is very acidic, and the ferns were actually kind of remediating that site to other plants to allow those to grow. And so by the next year, they started seeing more and more in the areas that the ferns had came in versus the areas the ferns didn't come into. And all the detritus of the decomposing ferns also brought in a lot more soil fungi, which were beneficial soil fungi that were decomposers, breaking things down, breaking down the pine needles, making it so other things could come in, but also mycorrhizal fungi that were able to form associations with new plants in the area. And they also can sequester carbon. So they're holding in that carbon, retain other important nutrients. But some ferns have actually been shown to rapidly accumulate and effectively remove harmful chemicals like arsenic from polluted areas. So this is a new horizon of study on trying to use ferns to remediate polluted areas. But there's a lot of promise. And then are they food though? Most ferns, they produce some sort of compound that they deter herbivores from eating them, whether they're an insect or a mammal, they just don't really get consumed. So it's one of the ways that if you have overpopulation of deer, which I'm sure we all do in our backyards, and we're trying to get some nice beneficial ground cover, ferns can be very helpful because deer will generally leave them alone. You always have that one fawn that's like, I don't know, maybe if I try to eat it a seventh time, it might actually taste good and not make me sick. So ferns generally are pretty good. Some arthropods do eat ferns and can rely on them almost like solely on ferns. And then some moths as well will use them as larval host plants, but in general, they're not considered a food source. They are very beneficial on the landscape, though. Now, with that, we will talk about how to identify them. So, as you can see, it's quite easy. This one, we have a fern. This is also a fern, and this is not a fern. So, case closed, we're done. No, we'll continue on. Now, what should you bring when you go to want to look at ferns? You will want to get a nice hand lens. A hand lens is going to be magnifying around 10 times is what I'd recommend. You can get just a general magnifying glass. You're going to want something to help you see these minute details, whether they're the hairs on the rachis or the shape of that sori or whether or not it has that indusium. So you do want a hand lens and then bring along a nice field guide. I'll talk about a few at the end. And then what I forgot to put in this photo was a notepad. Make sure to get some notes. You're going to want some photos. We all have our nice camera phones now, so grab some photos, grab the top, grab the bottom. We'll talk about some good practices when using iNaturalist at the end of the program, but it's always good to have a notepad too. Write down what you saw nearby, where you're at, all that good stuff can be very beneficial when you're trying to identify this back at home. Once you're in the area, though, it is important to start with that full picture. Look all around. So don't just hone in on that one specific individual fern. Look all around because some species can be kind of difficult between the two, like ostrich fern and cinnamon fern can be kind of hard to tell apart, but where they grow will differ. With cinnamon fern, generally in wet areas, ostrich fern can handle more dry areas. Ostrich fern will also tend to grow in these structures right here. So you'll have this whole field of upright ferns. So try to really think about where you are. Are you in an open, like a canopy gap? Is there a lot of sun versus are you deep in the woods? Are you right by water? All that kind of stuff. So always think about where you are. And this is important for anything really. Any bird that you're going to identify, any flower you're going to identify, any mushroom you're going to identify. Really try to hone in on that big picture idea first. Then take a close look and do some division. So the pinna, how it divides can be very crucial for identification. So in this Christmas fern, we really don't have any division whatsoever. There are some what looks like serrated edges and there are some points, but overall, this is one entire pinna. There's no pinnule. There are no divisions here. Versus on this guy, we do have bipinnate. So this whole structure, that's our ear, that's our pinna, and it is divided once on this side and once on this side. So we have this bipinnate structure. Then over here, this is what a lot of people picture when you say fern, this nice lacy foliage. We not only have that bipinnate of this portion, but now we also have some bifurcation, some division right here in the pinnule. It looks more like serrations, deep serrations. So that can be very important. There are less in our area that have no division. So making note of that can really help you identify it. And even the bipinnate is a little less likely to see when it looks like this. Then try to really see, are there unique structures coming out of this? Does it have this weird wavy canoe paddle made out of beads growing out of the middle? Does it have tendrils that end in a heart-shaped leaf? Does it have one single stalk coming out of the middle of the fern that is poofy and looks like Solomon plume flowers? All these things are important to note because they can help you identify that fern almost instantly in some cases. Then turn it over. See if you're lucky enough to see these sori, because here's the tricky thing. These will not always be present. So some ferns have what we would call a fertile frond. So that is the frond, the leaf that produces the sori that will end up producing spores. Some fronds are sterile or vegetative. They will not have sori. So if you go out, like I said you should, and turn over a frond and you're like, there's nothing on here, Nick lied to me. It could be a sterile frond. Or it could be a fern that doesn't actually make what we generally think of as a fertile frond, or it's only going to make some sori at a specific time of year. Some will only have these sori on a portion of the frond. So turn it over and hopefully you're lucky and you have the sori. If so, get pictures of them. It's going to be a whole lot easier to get into your field guide and figure out what kind of fern you have. Then really look close, like close, close, close. Get that hand lens out. Really start testing out the zoom on your camera phone lens and get close to the base of the stipe. Does it have these scales? Get really close to the rachis. Does it have a groove and little hairs? Do the hairs continue on to the pinna? Are they on both sides, on the upper and underside? All this is very, very critical. So whenever you're identifying anything, know you can never write down too much information. So you can never get too many photos. All this can be very helpful for your own learning process too. You can start to realize, oh, whenever I see this and this, it's got to be this species. I really don't need to have 7 photos for it. All right. With that, we are going to get into the common ferns of Pennsylvania. So we'll run through a few of the species in our area, talk about how to ID them, maybe how they grow. So if you're interested, a lot of these species are sold both with our own native plant nursery at Beechwood Farms, and you can find these at a lot of other native plant suppliers. There are around 65 or so species in Pennsylvania. Most of these also occur in Southwest PA within our area. So I'm not going to go through all of the ferns in our area. We'd be here all night and then some. So we'll definitely cover some of the what I consider the common ones. I kind of went through iNaturalist and saw determined some of these based on the number of observations, and I threw in a few that I just think are really cool and know that they occur at some of our nature reserves. So these are species that you can encounter, but you might have some that we do not cover tonight. But at the end, again, we'll talk about some resources that will have way more information. Up first is one of my favorites. You're probably going to hear me say that a bunch tonight because I have a lot of favorite ferns. So, northern maidenhair. This is one that will grow. The frond will be anywhere from like a foot and a half to over 2 feet in height. This one looks really cool on a slope, I think. It kind of drapes down and it's very wide. But to identify it, you're going to look at the underside and you're going to see these indusium right here. The indusium is actually it's just the pinna is rolled back at that point. So the sori are protected by a rolled portion of the maidenhair fern. So that is a very specific thing with how it's occurring right at the edge, right at the margin on the underside. But also it's going to have a black rachis and a black stipe, very dark. And then it has a unique growth form right here with that semicircle. So this is a very cool fern. It kind of comes up. We have a stipe right here, forms this little semicircle, and then this palmate growth where it's like a big a hand with too many fingers spread out. So this is a really great one. It loves partial to full shade. As long as it's rich, moist soil, it can tolerate some sun, but it doesn't like dry spells. So if you get this one is a fern that you can find a lot of areas. You can't let it dry out. It really needs to have that rich, moist soil, but it is great for hills. And here's a close up of that false indusium. So in this photo, you can kind of see a little bit better. It's just this rolled portion, whereas a true indusium will be a scale, like a separate structure. But this is literally just a portion of the frond that kind of curls over, and the sori, the sporangium rather, are underneath here, well protected. Again, you're gonna hear me say a lot, but this is another one of my favorites because this is such a versatile plant. Sensitive fern, despite its name, is one of our hardier ferns. It can tolerate a little bit more sun and a little bit more dryness than other ferns. And the name comes from as soon as we get a cold snap, as soon as we get frost, the frond is going to die back. But there is still some winter interest that we'll see in a second. As far as identifying it, it is a pretty unique shape. So it's pretty easy to ID once you kind of look for these wavy margins here. So wavy margin at the base of the pinna that kind of comes a little less oscillation there. So it smooths out towards the tip of the pinna. And there's also going to be a winged rachis. So in between the pinna, there's still a little bit of a leafy extension on the rachis itself. This is one that it's kind of a pale yellow green, so it looks very unique. However, you can start second guessing yourself because the height is very wide on this. So it's anywhere from like 8 inches to 40 inches in height. This can get quite large if the conditions are perfect for it. I'd say the average is around a foot, and that isn't necessarily upright. It's kind of, they do drape over, but in total, the length of that frond would be around a foot to maybe 2 feet. That's probably the average, but I have seen some really long sensitive ferns. Now, when that frond dies back, just before around midsummer, you will start to see these. So it's this fertile stalk. So we have this stipe right here that has these bead-like structures. But if you were to zoom in real close, like this awesome photo from Wikimedia here, they look like little mini ferns because they're pinna. So they're curled up pinna that are protecting the sporangia. But from afar, they look like bead structures. So they come out, and if you catch them when they're first fresh, they're green, but then they quickly turn brown as they mature. This structure will persist into winter, so I think that it's a very unique winter interest in any garden, and that is just more spores. And so sensitive fern can help you fill in an area that's wet and shady, and you just don't know what to do with it. And this is one that it's an urban fern. You'll oftentimes just luckily get one showing up in your backyard. So keep an eye out for sensitive fern. It's a great little micro habitat creator. Lady fern is one that I see quite often. There are two species that we'll talk about here. It can actually be three species, but really we'll just look at the northern and lady, or sorry, the northern and southern lady fern. And with ID for this, they almost always kind of have this lax tip. So it tapers to a point, and it's always just kind of flailing in the wind. It doesn't really stay upright and doesn't form a full droop. It just kind of meh. And so that little tapered point, that meh off to the side, that's a scientific term. That is very good for ID from far away. And then what you do is, as you're looking closely, you're going to see that there are brown scales at the base of the stipe, and that the rachis is generally smooth with occasionally minute hairs. Like you'd really have to be like, maybe they're there, versus some things that have very obvious hairs, very obvious pubescence. So this is going to be pretty much smooth rachis except for the brown scales. And that lax tapering tip. And once you think you've got a lady fern, you can then try to figure out if you've got the northern or southern. Northern is much more common in Pennsylvania. Southern does still occur pretty much throughout the entire state. It's just a little less common. For ID between the two, northern has a frond that is wider above the base, kind of near the middle, whereas southern is widest at the base of the frond here, which is kind of nice because it lines up with southern. So it's widest to the south, northern, it's wider to the north. So usually northern's widest at the middle here, and southern is widest at the base here. Hay-scented fern. This is a fun one. It varies in size. You can see this one locally. There's a good amount of it around Heartwood Acres, but if you go into any really rich Pennsylvania woods in the open glades, you'll see a lot of hay-scented fern, because with the overgrazing deer, this is one that can easily take off. So this is a situation where you have a very aggressive native plant, but sometimes this is what people want to see. And these did occur even before overpopulation, these fern glades of hay-scented fern. They just might be a little more abundant now. They do prefer a little bit more well-drained, sandy soil, so they don't tolerate too much of that like standing water. And they tolerate sun fairly well. In fact, that's why you usually see them in canopy gaps. This is me working in eastern PA. Hay scented ferns just like up to my waist almost, and they're all over. They do have kind of a unique smell. It makes field work very treacherous because every single square inch of this is covered in rocks and boulders and sticks that I cannot see. But for identifying them, they will be looking at the stipe. You're going to see that it darkens at the base. So green above, kind of dark brown below, and they're covered in these glandular hairs. It's not quite sticky. It's more like very fine Velcro. So if you go to like bend the hay scented fern and to look at the underside, it'll kind of stick to itself. So these somewhat sticky glandular hairs are all over the stipe and the rachis, and it does taper to that nice little point here, but no scales, and it's just got that nice dark stipe base, but just above it, it will turn green. So tapered tip, bicolored stipe. That will help you identify hay-scented fern and all those glandular hairs. This is one, again, you'll probably see this more in some woodland areas, mature forest. The sori can help you because this is one with the lady fern having those minute hairs occasionally on the rachis. You might try to confuse the two. They both have the tapering tip. But if the sori are present, this is a situation where we can see that they're vastly different shapes. So the lady fern will have linear or these hooked horseshoe shaped sori kind of at the center of each of the pinnule versus hay scented has these rounded sori right at the edge of the pinnule, like where it has the bifurcation right here. So that little bit at the margin, much different than the lady ferns. Ostrich fern. This is a good one for when you're wanting a showstopper fern in your own backyard. These things can be upwards of about 50 inches in length. And they prefer dappled shade, so a little bit of dappled sunlight. Leaves will start to turn yellow in the full sun. So if you've got these in the full sun, don't be surprised if they don't look too happy. They're going to want anywhere from like medium to wet soil. This is a fun one though because they are quite tolerant of acidic soil. So if you've got the space under one of your conifers, whether it's a spruce or a white pine, as long as it's got somewhat wet to medium soil, you could do some ostrich ferns under those. So that's one of the nice woodland ferns that will also tolerate the acidic soil that happens with those conifer needles. And this will have that nice outward arch pattern to them. They will vegetatively spread on their own. The frond will die back in the wintertime, but just like the sensitive fern, you will actually have this nice, cool, fertile frond persist in the wintertime. It's a little bit more flattened, so I think of them like canoe paddles a bit more than the sensitive fern, but these little frond, fertile fronds full of sori will persist for you in the wintertime. Another good one for your own backyard is New York fern. It won't get as big. It's about half the size of ostrich fern. So instead of getting up to 50 inches, maybe around 25, so like 2 feet or so. This also is fine with some acidic soil. So New York fern will oftentimes be found under hemlock trees and some of the other areas, as long as it's a bit wet. So you see these kind of showing up closer to swampy areas or seeps. But the identifier on this, we have it tapering at both ends. So I will say that New Yorkers live life fast and they're burning the candle at both ends. So you can think of it like that. We got tapered tip here and it tapers at the base. So when you start seeing that, start thinking New York fern. You can start looking at some of the other characteristics, but that two tapering, that really does help you key in on it. Here are the sori on the New York fern. So we have these little horseshoe shaped sori covered in an indusium. So this is a little scale. On the right, it's the same thing, but basically what we're looking at on the left is the indusium, the scale, with sporangia that aren't quite mature enough. And then over here, they are bursting at the seams. So all these sporangia are ready to shoot out spores, and we still have a little bit of that horseshoe shape. So in a hand lens, you're going to still see that scale indusium. So this is our New York fern. Wood ferns, we aren't going to spend a whole lot of time on these because this is a complicated genus. Wood ferns hybridize like crazy, and there's already a good number of Dryopteris in Pennsylvania. They can hybridize, so some of these traits will be a little intermediate between the two species. In general, when it comes to wood ferns, I look for this groove in the rachis. We do have this tripinnate, so we have lacy foliage, and then I look at the rachis and I see this groove, and I immediately start thinking wood fern. From there, I look at the base of the stipe, and our wood ferns generally have the brown scales. At this point, once you think you have a wood fern, if you want to figure out which type of wood fern you have, you're going to really want to pull out your field guide. You're going to want to flip this over, look at sori. Some of these are evergreen, so if you're seeing these in the winter time, it really limits the option of what you have. It could still be a hybrid, and that's what makes this one kind of hard is a lot of the identification for this is going to come down to where the sori is placed on the back of the pinna. Is it at the margin? Is it in the middle? Is it somewhere in between? And unfortunately, with the hybridization, there can be even more in between those. So this can be a very difficult group to get down to species, but sometimes you get one that's just a very obvious example of a certain species. So it's a fun one, but I generally look for the brown scales and that groove in the rachis, and I more or less most of the time just leave it at wood fern. This is actually how we sell them in our shop too, is we just say wood fern, Dryopteris species. But this is a great one. They generally tolerate a lot more conditions. They do for the most, I mean, each species is a little bit different. So again, that full picture, like figuring out where you are, can help you get that species. But they're going to be good with rocky terrain as long as it's got mostly shade. Some prefer a little bit more water than others, but they're fairly adaptable. Um, just so you know, there's about like 7 recorded Dryoptera species in Pennsylvania and like 250 worldwide. So this is a pretty big genus. All right, another favorite one, Christmas fern. This is usually one that a lot of folks want because it is evergreen. So you've got that nice winter interest, that nice green for you throughout those cold months. It does get to be somewhat big, around like a foot to 2 feet or so in length. It tends to flatten. So as it comes out with this erect growth, it will flatten out. This has incredibly scaled stipe. So that is a great identifier. There's one lookalike that we'll look at. So seeing those brown hairs and like it's just shaggy. It's not even scales, it's not even hairs, it's somewhere in between. It's just like a shag carpet on this stipe. But the pinna has a unique shape. So it's got this nice notch right here. That notch is a fantastic diagnostic trait. And the way I think of it is it looks like Santa's sleigh or a little elf boot. So again, we have our Christmas theme with our Christmas fern. Not only is it around at Christmas time, but it also has Santa's sleigh on it. This is one that has the sori are produced at the very top, the apex of the frond. So if you turned it over and it was actually producing the sori, you're going to see that it produces a ton of spores, and it's just at the top. So the lower pinna that aren't pictured have none of these on them. It's just the like last maybe third of the fern has these on the underside, and it just makes so much. Like you don't even get to see the shape of the sori because it's just the entire pinna is essentially covered in this. Versus the one lookalike that I could think of that you might confuse this with is the ebony spleenwort. So ebony spleenwort is going to be much smaller, averaging probably only a foot in length versus up to like 2.5 feet with that Christmas fern. So the 12 inches or so, and then you've got this really nice black or dark brown stipe. The name ebony spleenwort, the ebony part is coming from that dark stipe, versus the Christmas fern had a green stipe that had some of the scales even on the rachis. This will also not have the it's a smooth rachis. It's a smooth stipe, so it won't have those scales on there. You can confuse it with Christmas fern because it has that spur. But if you turned it over, you'd see that the sori, instead of being this crazy mass, are just these diagonal hot dogs. So ebony spleenwort has the little hot dogs and that ebony, dark brown, blackish stipe. This is one that it likes to grow in shady rock areas. So this does well in shady rock gardens because naturally this is what you'll see growing on some like rock faces. Or if you're walking around shady side and if you start looking at some of the rock walls outside of the houses, you might see some ebony spleen warts poking out. They'll just kind of find their way to exist there. This is a rare one, rock polypody. This is maybe a foot or so in length. The growing conditions, though, it likes shady places. It likes rocks. This is semi-evergreen to evergreen if the winters aren't too bad. Much more evergreen in the south. The fertile frond tends to be shorter, so you'll be looking at these and trying to figure out what it is. You're gonna see that it has, it's almost like Christmas fern in that it has that spur, but they alternate a little bit more versus on the Christmas fern, or sorry, the overlap, we have this nice alternated pinna, and we even have that on the spleenwort. But on the rock polypody, that spur, it overlaps with itself on either side. And the fertile frond, it is shorter, so you kind of know, oh, maybe I should check this one. And you'll see on the underside, it has really nice rounded sori. But this grows like it'll just be on top of a boulder with almost no substrate underneath it. And you can find this one all over Todd Nature Reserve. So our location in Sarver. If you haven't been there, highly recommend it. Amazing place to get away. It's our only place that does not have a facility, so there are no bathrooms. However, Buffalo Creek Nature Park is not that far away. But Todd Nature Reserve, we have a lot of trails, and there is actually a trail called, you can find our trail maps on our website. There's a trail called Polypody Trail. And if you walk along that, you're going to find boulders, and those boulders are covered in this species. So this is a really cool one because it'll be right on top of a boulder, hardly any substrate, just exist in its life. Now, while you're there, keep your eye out for this fun one. So this is rattlesnake fern. This is actually kind of, you could consider rattlesnake fern, this genus and the family that it's in, not quite true ferns. They're some taxonomists will put it in what's called grape ferns, and there is a grape fern that you can see at Todd as well. It'll be very similar shape. But rattlesnake fern, I always get excited when I see they have a fertile stalk. So this fern base, the fronds at the bottom here, you won't see sori on them. Instead, it will send up a stalk that has that nice little, it looks like a flower at the top. So this triangular shape and that stalk really tells you rattlesnake fern. The folklore is that the point on that triangle is pointing to the closest rattlesnake. So you know where it is. And I guess, I mean, if you walked in a single straight line where this is pointing and just kept on going, eventually you might find a rattlesnake. I don't hold a lot of faith in that folklore, but it's there. Now, you could confuse, when I say this triangular growth, rattlesnake fern, I'd say from like here to here, maybe 20 inches. They aren't necessarily that big though. So most of the time, this is like an entire length of about a foot. And you could confuse that triangular growth with bracken fern. Bracken ferns also, I see those at like Heartwood and some of the other woodland areas. It will have what looks like a triangular growth, but it's going to be a lot larger. And bracken fern will have some fertile fronds. So if you look on the underside, you're going to see some sori-like structures on the margin versus rattlesnake fern, you're just ever going to have this stalk. So if you have that stalk, you have this triangular shape, you've got rattlesnake fern. I did put a bonus in here because I do get questions about this one a lot. So if you have any idea, this is probably not native with a name like Japanese painted fern. However, some of you have probably seen this. Some might call it ghost fern. This is around 12 to 30 inches. It is often planted. You'll find these available in nurseries. It is a cultivated variety that we generally buy. This is what this photo actually came from iNaturalist in Japan. So this is what the like type species looks like. It has then since been cultivated because it has this kind of reddish midrib, this rachis right here, and even the little bit of midrib of the pinna is red. So that was selected for, resulting in this. So Japanese painted fern, this fern here, ghost fern, whatever you might call it commonly, is not native. It is not considered invasive in the US. Anecdotally, I will randomly find this in the middle of the woods. In fact, I was doing a mushroom walk at Hampton. We just found this and a bunch of other like um, cultivated plants in the trailhead of Rachel Carson. So it's like, was there a little homestead here? Anyway, the I've never really seen it spread. It does have a creeping rhizome, so if you have this right up against a woodland, it might spread in a little bit, but it's not considered invasive anywhere, so don't worry too much. But I would consider one of our native ferns. You might have some of those moths that will use it as its host plant. All right, so those were some of the common ones we have in our area. So I hope that is clear as mud, but I also hope that you aren't too overwhelmed and you want to learn more. So if you do, I do have some resources that I highly recommend. The first one is a field guide, the Peterson's field guide. This was my first field guide for ferns. I love this one still. It's packed full of information and it's just it's just small enough that I don't mind it in my backpack. So it's not too big. This has some great pictures. It has great drawings that point out. So each species has a drawing that will point to the identifying traits, the best things for diagnostic identification. So really, really recommend this Peterson's Field Guide. I recently picked up this one. This has a bit broader scale, so we don't have just ferns, and we'll talk about club mosses. However, it is a bit bigger, so this one I use as a reference. It did have some good information. The pictures are real nice, so this has some high quality photos, and it talks a lot more about the ranges. I did enjoy this book. I do recommend it. And if you just kind of want to have something to keep in your backpack at all times, maybe try to start identifying some of the ferns. The Fern Finder is the one that I recommend. So these are the very small little dichotomous keys. So they're picture dichotomous keys. If you don't know what that is, it's essentially if it has this feature, go to this page. If it has this feature, though, stay on this page and go to this. So it's like a choose your own adventure book for identifying stuff. So dichotomous keys can be very effective when identifying certain things, and the Fern Finder has some really good resources and pictures, drawings. So I do like this one, and it's something that you can pick up pretty cheap. We do sell these type of finder books at our nature store, but if you're coming out just for that, I would call ahead to see if we have the Fern one in stock. Otherwise, you can find this one at a lot of other bookstores. So do recommend the Fern Finder. And then, of course, I always recommend iNaturalist. I think this is a great resource if you aren't familiar with it. iNaturalist is a free app that you can download. There's also a web application. This is a citizen science tool that allows you to submit photos and it will suggest an ID based on some machine learning software as well as successfully confirmed observations in our area or the area that you took the photo. So it will track the location of the photo, allows it to pinpoint a species, can be very effective with ferns, but once it's actually submitted, people can agree or disagree with your observation, kind of helping you. So even you can even put in an observation at a higher level. You can just say, I don't know what it is, I just know it's a fern. And other people can take a look at your photos and try to figure out if they can narrow it down. Once at least two people agree on a species, it's considered research grade, and at that point, it can kind of be pulled into some data sets. When you're doing this, though, it is very important to try to get some quality photos. So don't just do one photo from far away and at like arm's reach or at chest level or something. Try to get multiple photos because, as you saw, there are a lot of things that we need to look for on ferns. So if you have no idea and you just want to have someone else help you, try to get a lot of photos of that individual and individuals nearby. Do get that broad scale photo, because sometimes the growth form is very important, there's a spot in iNaturalist to put some notes. So if you saw like a pool of water nearby, that can be helpful to try to figure out, oh, it's in a wet area. But get the underside, get those sori, check multiple ferns. If you don't see one underneath the first frond that you look at some other fronds. But try to get a photo of those sori. If you have something that you can put in for scale, if I'm out trying to identify stuff like this, I keep a small little ruler in my backpack. I'll put that on the photo. That can be very helpful to get someone who's helping, trying to help you ID this, give them some scale. But in this case, like I think there were 5 photos in total. Might be a little bit of overkill, but I'd rather have more photos on these observations than less. Just make sure that you're getting some good ones of different angles. So in this, we can see there's some hairs on the rachis. We have the sori. We have an overview of that entire frond, and there's probably some photos of the stipe, the base of the fern. All right.